Welcome to the anointed teaching preached at Church 316, the youth arm of the Fountain of Life Church. We hope that you be blessed as you listen to this message.
There we go. Took a minute, but we got there eventually.
Yes, good. Yeah. Welcome, Dr. Tobi.
Hi. I don't often do live, so it's quite weird to be on Instagram live.
Yeah. And I'm sure this is a part of you that a lot of 360 members have never seen.
Yes, I think a lot of people haven't seen this side of what I do, my work. Yes, You're right.
Today we're giving them first-hand experience of the doctor. They only know the pastor side. So today everyone is going to see the doctor side.
Yeah, I'm happy to help. I'm happy that you're doing this because I think that we need to talk about mental health as well. I think there's been a lot of emphasis on how to physically stay safe and what to do from a physical health perspective. I think maybe one of the things I wanted to touch on, because I quite liked your topic, which was mental health in times of COVID-19. And I thought a really helpful place to start maybe was just to think around why would we be thinking about mental health during this time. And before I get into it, just wanted to check with you, PB, because I know that we want to make this quite interactive. And I know that people have sent in questions. But would people also be able to send in questions as we're talking, just in case there's anything I say that you want?
I'm looking at the feed.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So just in case I say something and you want me to clarify, just feel free to say. So I think thinking about mental health at this time, I think one of the things I wanted to really emphasize is that our mental health and our physical health are linked, and you can't really separate the two. And they work really well together, and they work hand in hand. And when one is off balance, that can impact the other. So even though we're talking about COVID-19 and we know that it's a virus and it's something physical, we also know that because of that connection between our physical and mental health, we cannot talk about one without talking about the other. And I think something else to really say and to hone in as well is that part of COVID-19 is that it's really disrupted life as we know it. And even though, COVID-19 is a threat to our health, because of all the changes that we're experiencing, it's also becoming a threat to just how we're living in general. And that can bring up a lot of different emotions for us. And so that's also part of talking about mental health. And I think the last thing I wanted to touch on with that as well is because a lot of us are having to stay at home during this period, a lot of the ways that we would have coped in the past or initially, we might not feel like we have easy access to those ways of coping. So to have this physical threat, to have to stay home, to have this disruption to our life as we know it, and not being able to pull on our usual strategies can all impact our mental health. So I think that's why it's really important that we are talking about mental health as we speak about how to deal and live through COVID-19.
Awesome. So do you want us to go straight into the questions now?
Yeah, I think we should dive right in because that will be more useful to people who are logging in.
Okay, so the first question is, we need you to demystify mental health, because there's this notion that mental health is just people that you see roaming on the streets, either going naked or tearing their clothes off. So we need you to first clarify what mental health is.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you're asking that question because there's a lot of stigma around mental health. And I think maybe I'm going to constantly be referring to physical health because that's a reference that everyone knows and everyone understands. And when we talk about physical health, we're just talking about how your body is functioning on a day-to-day basis to allow you to engage in activities and things that matter to you. And it's the same with mental health. So when we talk about mental health, we're just literally talking about the way you're thinking, feeling, and reacting so that you can carry out your day-to-day work and so you can thrive in your environment and have relationships and maintain relationships. So I think something else to say is that, yes, there is a spectrum when it comes to mental health. And when we start talking about mental health difficulties, that's when thinking, feeling, and reacting become a struggle. And then you're finding it really hard to engage in things that matter to you. So it impacts your daily functioning. And that has to happen over a period of time. So it's not a one-off thing. So it's over a course of time. So this has to happen over a course of time and impact your daily functioning before we start talking about mental health difficulties. And even when people are struggling with mental health difficulties, that's not the end all be all. People recover from mental health difficulties every single day. People are still able to live and thrive with the right support with mental health difficulties. And actually, it's something that we know a lot of people experience. So what we know from stats is that 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health difficulty. So it's actually more common than we think it is. So even our friends, our loved ones, our co-workers, people that we see all the time, there is a high chance that they're experiencing mental health difficulties. But because we're not talking about it and we're going on with life, we don't know. And so I guess I'm saying mental health has many faces. And even when we're experiencing struggles, it has many faces as well. It doesn't show on your face. So people can be struggling and you have no idea. And the extreme of when you see people, I think that image that you gave of like people running on the streets and you know, being naked, I think that is really the extreme. And that's especially when things have prolonged over a long period of time and people haven't gotten the necessary help that they need to readjust back into doing what matters to them.
Okay, awesome. So you mentioned mental health difficulties. So what are the kind of signs to look out for in ourselves and in our loved ones so that we're able to identify when someone has difficulties and be able to help?
I think the first thing that we often say to everyone is just to ask the questions, how are you, and to mean it. And I mean, I will talk about other signs, but the truth of the matter is sometimes people may be going through things and you have no idea if they don't tell you, if they don't physically say to you, I am struggling. And so the main thing that you can do ever, whether it's with your loved ones or anyone, is to ask that question and genuinely mean it. Because a lot of times we say, how are you? And we're just expecting the automatic response, which is, I'm fine, thank you, and you? And we all do it. Like, even when we're not fine, we just automatically all say, I'm fine, thank you, and you. So to ask that question, how are you? And really mean it and give that space to get a response. So how are you? And pause and actually wait to listen to what the other person says and be curious about their genuine well-being. I think other things that you might notice about people if they're struggling with their mental health difficulties is a withdrawal in things that they usually do, their daily activity. So often you might find that people who are struggling with mental health difficulties might start withdrawing from relationships or social events, or struggling to get out of bed in the morning, so lacking motivation in things, or lacking pleasure when they're doing things, or just being disinterested in things as well. So those are some general signs that you might see when people are beginning to struggle with difficulties with their mental health. And I think those would be the key things that I would say. So one, genuinely ask how people are doing and actually pause to listen. If you notice a change in their behavior, it could be even something minute of sleeping longer in bed over a long period of time than they usually would, or start withdrawing from social interactions, or struggling to engage in work or things that they used to do, or not finding the pleasure in things. Those sometimes can be indicators. But again, without like jumping the gun or assuming, it's always best just to ask people, how are you doing?
Fantastic. So we're learning. When we ask now, we'll wait for a response, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's fantastic. We'll do that. Okay, so let's get into COVID-19 a bit, because we got a question that during COVID-19, a lot of people are actually losing their job or have been told to go on compulsory leave, unpaid leave. Some people don't even know they've lost their jobs yet until when all this is over and all of that come to the open. So now the question is, how do you then begin to cope if you see that you're having mental health difficulties, which could be depression, or whatever the range is, how do you cope with such situations? For people that are introverts, for example, who don't like to talk, but how do you cope with such difficulties when you have?
I think the first thing to say is that there isn't a right or wrong way to cope at this time. We're living in really unusual and different times than what any of us are used to. So there isn't kind of like, this is the right way for you to be coping right now, or this is the wrong way to be coping. And it's very normal and natural that people experience a whole range of different emotions, and they might find that there are changes in the way that they are behaving and reacting, and all that is normal. So that's one of the first things I really want to say. And so if you're finding that there's a change in how you're feeling, or there's a change in how you're behaving, this does not mean that you are depressed. This does not mean that you're anxious. And I think we need to be careful not to try to put labels on just a normal way of reacting to a very difficult time. And I think something else that people really should remember, although it doesn't feel that way at the moment, is that what we're going through is temporary. It's not finite, and it will pass. And sometimes that can be really important in terms of helping us to keep going and not to lose hope that things will change. And I think what you're describing about people losing their jobs or having to go on mandatory leave is the reality of what we are experiencing, is the reality of the situation we're experiencing. And so it's really just about what is the best way that I can keep going at this point to be able to survive and thrive during this difficult time. And I want to maybe, because I'm just mindful that what I want to share is something that would apply not just for jobs, but just in terms of going through dealing with COVID-19 in general. So I don't know if maybe I should pause a bit on that and maybe do that as a summary at the end. But I just think maybe the best thing that people should know now is, one, it's okay to feel a number of different things. Two, this too will pass. Three, also, especially what you were saying about people who are introverts. I think one of the main things to remember when you're dealing with difficult emotions or difficult thoughts is having a way to express them. Because sometimes when we hold on to those things, we begin to internalize a lot of those things, and it begins to feed internally, and they just stay there. And over time, things might start feeling worse and worse. So it's finding an outlet or a way to express how you're feeling. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to talk to someone about it, because sometimes people find that in itself quite anxiety-provoking and they don't want to do that. But there are different ways that you can express yourself. You can express yourself through writing, through art, through music. So finding a way to express how you're feeling. And I think something else to remember, especially with work, is that although work can be very, very stressful for a lot of us, one of the benefits of work is that it helps us develop a routine. So we have something that we're constantly doing during the day, and it helps us develop a pattern. And that is one of the main things that is really important for our mental health. So if all of a sudden that's broken because you've lost your job or your mandatory leave, so you don't have that pattern in your day, it might be worth trying to think about ways that you can build a routine right now at home. And that's really important, just to keep you going and to kind of develop that sense of safety and normalcy, even in this kind of really unpredictable times that we're in.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yes, we have to find ways to express ourselves. Sing, whether you can or not. Yeah, okay, that's really good. Okay, so
I want to say, sorry, PB, about this, because one of the things that can also be really helpful with dealing with difficult emotions is to remember that we're not alone. So that sense of common humanity, meaning that what you're experiencing now, there's somebody else that's also probably experiencing this as well. So it's not particular to you. And sometimes that can really help us kind of externalize things a bit, instead of saying that this is something about me or what I've done, or maybe I wasn't a really good worker and that's why I'm the one that's being laid off and others are not being laid off. And to remember that you're not in this alone. We're all in this together. We might all have different things that we're struggling with, but we all may be struggling with something. And so that sense of common humanity can really be helpful as well during this time.
Okay, now that you have said that, I think I need to bring this up. You know, on social media, a lot of people are having to be more on social media right now. And everyone seems to put their best foot forward on social media, which is understandable. So how do people then handle that social media pressure where they don't tend to, the word, tension themselves? Because I think a lot of young people are falling into that trap of just seeing someone's good path and looking at their own weaknesses in light of someone else's strength. So how do you undo, overemphasizing your own weakness in view of someone else's strength? How do you undo that?
I think maybe what you're touching on is not only a COVID thing, it's just a human thing. We all compare ourselves with others all the time. And unfortunately, when we do those comparisons, we always put ourselves at the losing end. So we're always kind of saying that person is better than us. So we all have, to some extent, there are different levels of comparison, but to some extent, we all compare ourselves to one another. And I think what you're touching on is social media can heighten that a lot of times, because social media is, it's like a facade of life, isn't it? It's like a life resume, like a life CV. Because like on your CV, you always put all your skills and everything that you're good at. And on social media, we do the same. Like we just put all the things that are going well and right in with our lives, and that's what we put there. And I think one of the reasons why we do that is because of validation. We want people to see that we're living well and to accept that and to love us. And when we start looking at that from that perspective, one, we normalize this idea that we have of like trying to compare ourselves. It's something that we do. It's a normal part of just the human mind and how we are. And I think something else that's really important about social media is that social media is not life. So sometimes we have to put the phone down and actually engage in life. And, we even say the same thing with COVID. If you're really involved in everything that's going on and watching the news, that can unintentionally trigger a lot of fear and anxiety around kind of dealing with COVID. And so we say to people, be mindful of how much you're putting in and take a break from that. And I think it's the same thing with social media. Just be mindful of how much time you're spending looking at what other people are doing and how that isn't what you're doing. And sometimes just putting the phone down is a way of taking care of yourself and taking care of your well-being and actually just engaging in life and connecting face to face with people. Because when you do that, you get a better representation of what life is like. And you get a sense that actually not everyone's like living the best life and has no difficulties and is not struggling. And it's a lot more balanced than that. And I think also in terms of helping people with, because I think we're also then touching on a little bit self-esteem, self-confidence, how you view yourself. It's also about, if you're engaging in life, just thinking about what is it that you enjoy. And I think we need to somehow change the perspective of doing things in order to get a reaction out of people and doing things in order to kind of better ourselves and to help with our overall well-being and improve how we're living and what matters to us and what really matters to us.
Wow, that's really fantastic. Okay, so you touched on a point on how to handle COVID-19, saying put your phone down if you're getting too much bad information. So aside from getting off the news, what other practical steps can you take to maintain your health, your mental health during this period, aside from getting off the phone?
Yeah, so definitely the one about taking off your phone is a key one. Another thing is take care of your body. Are we exercising? Are we moving our bodies? Also being quite mindful of what we're putting into our bodies, how we eating, because one of the ways that sometimes we cope with stress is that we tend to eat a lot or we don't eat at all. So just to be quite mindful of what we're putting into our bodies, just help our bodies to function and to keep functioning as best as it can. And also in terms of your taking care of your body as well, we have to talk about sleep. Sleep is really, really important because sleep is what kind of helps us in terms of restoratively, to just make sure that our body's working optimum function. So to look out for sleep as well. Another thing that's really important is taking care of our minds and our emotions. It's an interesting one to say, but at this time, I think one of the things that we know that will happen, and it's natural, is that we might find that we might be more anxious than usual. And we might have more worries than we usually do normally. So part of taking care of our minds is becoming a bit more aware of when that's happening. So one thing to recognize about anxiety is that anxiety is future oriented. So it's often getting us to think about potential problems and difficulties that we might experience. But the way that anxiety presents things is that when we think about those problems, we often also worry that we may not be able to cope with them. So one, we're thinking about problems, and then we think about our inability to manage or cope with them. So one of the many things that you can do to take care of your mind is, one, become aware of when that's happening. So when your mind is taking you to the future, because the thing about worries is that you can experience the distress of the future, but you can't change anything about the future. So where you can affect the most change is in the present. So when you notice that you're more future oriented, think about different things you can do to be a bit more present. And the way that God has created us and the lovely way that He's made us is that anything that involves our senses can help us to be more present. So one of the things with our breathing. So taking really deep breaths, because you can only breathe in the present. You can't breathe in the future. You can't breathe in the past. So sometimes taking really deep breaths can help break that kind of, what's that word? Like when when your worries are almost kind of like on a cycle, they're just like a treadmill. They're just going one after the other, after the other, after the other. And sometimes taking really deep breaths can help break that cycle of worry and just to help us slow down. Another thing is we think about our senses, what we can see around us. So sometimes just looking at 5 things you can see around you, again, can help us to be more present, because you can only see things around you in the present. Also, what you're listening to, so music or worship music or the word, listening, you can only do that in the present. So that's something else that can bring you back into the present. Also, moving our bodies as well. You can only move your body in the present. And it's interesting how powerful just moving our bodies can break that kind of being more up here in our minds and helping us to come back here to what's happening in the moment. And another thing that you have to remember about worries is that worries are often linked to what we care about. That's why it's a worry. Yeah, is because it's linked to something that we value. We don't want something to happen because that thing is important to us. And so once we begin to make that connection between worries and values, that can help us reframe our worries. So what is it exactly that we're worrying about? And are they things that we can actually do now? So if we're worried about, a loved one or how loved ones are going to be affected by COVID, how can we be present for loved ones now? What are things that we can do at this moment to help our loved ones? If we're worried about our health, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going to happen if I did get COVID. Would my immune system be able to fight it off? Okay, what can we do in terms of helping our health at the moment? Can we exercise? Can we look at what we're putting into our bodies? Can we look at how much sleep we're getting? So again, what we've just done there can be summarized into 3 main things, which is to be opened, aware, and engaged. So 1, being open to what is it that's showing up for me at the moment, whether it's my worries or my emotions. How is it showing up for me? So is it showing up in terms of how I'm acting? Am I a bit more antsy or irritable, or am I not sleeping well? Am I not eating well? How is it showing up for me? And the last thing is then choosing, how do I want to respond to that? Being aware that your worries or anxiety is mostly linked to what we value.
Wow, that's important information. Someone said, are we going to save it? Yes, we're going to save it so you can always watch it over and over again. Open, aware, and engage. And you mentioned something about worrying about your loved ones. I think we should touch on one of the questions here. Some people have unfortunately lost their loved ones to COVID-19. For those kind of people, how do they cope with the trauma of losing a loved one?
So I think the first thing to say, is really sorry for your loss. Like, these are really difficult times. It's one thing to just lose a loved one in general, but to lose a loved one during this time when there's a lot of restrictions as to how we can express our love and grief. And for some people, we won't even be able to kind of be with our loved ones when they're passing because of all the, the advice around social distancing. So actually during this time, it can be really difficult to deal with loss in the context of COVID. And I'm saying that to say that, therefore, again, it's really important that people are not hard on themselves as to how they're dealing with it, because you're dealing with loss, but then on top of that, you're still dealing with COVID. And on top of that, you're dealing with kind of not being able to do things the way that you're usually used to doing. So that sense of normalcy and routine. So there's a lot of different things at the same time that you're having to deal with. When it comes to grief, and I'm sure this is a repetition, but that's because sometimes these things are really important to hone in. There isn't a right or wrong way of grieving. And there isn't a manual book of how to grieve. And so it's really important that we allow ourselves to experience the grief in whatever way that it shows up for us. And I think also in linked to that as well is timing. So one thing we know about grief is something that over time you kind of adjust to. There is no kind of mechanism of do this, and this, and then you will feel no grief. Because grief is a normal and natural reaction to losing something that's important to you, to losing a relationship. So you will grieve. So one, there's no kind of right or wrong way of grieving, but two as well, we kind of have to take each day as it comes. And we have to time is our best friend with grief. We kind of just have to let time pass and adjust with that, because there is no way to kind of not grieve or grieve better. Something else that I read recently, which I think is also important, is to try to alternate between loss and restorative activities. And what that means is that, there's, even the Bible says it's a time to grieve. It's a time, and loss activities is really about, acknowledging the loss. And also kind of if you need to do things around preparation for kind of burial arrangements, letting people know you have to have time to do all those things, because that's also part of closure. That's also part of you recognizing and acknowledging that something really important to you has come to an end, and we have to allow ourselves that space to do that. So one, there has to be that lost time where we are doing things in terms of closing that loss, or making sure that our loved one gets a proper funeral and people are aware of that. And restorative activities is, in addition to that, then also doing things to take care of ourselves. Especially when we are experiencing loss, one of the things that we really want to do is connect with other people. And I know that might sound a bit cliche, but it's really important. Social interactions, we know they can have a soothing effect on our minds and our bodies. And actually, social interactions can help release endorphins, which are what we call like our body's morphine, our body's soothing and calming hormones. So being around people when you're experiencing loss is really important, even though it seems very counterintuitive, because what you want to do when you're experiencing love is you want to just withdraw and be by yourself. And also, I think that sometimes being around people who know, or who also kind of had relationships with the person that you have lost, can be important, because that can be used as an avenue to talk about the memories that you have with the person that you lost, and to really solidify the relationship and what made it really special, and to exchange those moments with one another. can really be helpful as well. I'm really mindful that I'm talking a lot, and I really was hoping that this would be a bit more interactive. So I'm quite curious to hear what people are thinking about the things that I've spoken about already.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of affirmations, and people are definitely learning a lot. But I think that most people want to learn from the experts just to be sure that, maybe what you're doing so far is correct or you're doing things wrong. And I think people are just learning how best to deal with the mental health, because people don't speak about it often. So when you get someone speaking about it, you're very open to learning. I think that's why, because I've seen a couple of comments, and yeah, I guess
I'm seeing one of my really good friends on here, AK. Hey, AK. Okay, yeah, you're right. And I think something that you said, which is really important, and this is something that I really want to highlight, is again, when you're thinking about your mental health, it isn't really about the right or wrong way of dealing with it. It's more about what is working. And when I say what is working, what I mean by that is what you're doing opening you up and allowing you to continue to engage in what matters to you. That's what we're often looking about when we talk about mental health. So it's not about it's not prescriptive, and even all the things that I'm saying on there, these are all suggestions. You might find that some things work for you and some things don't, and that's okay. And the point about speaking about mental health is so that you can begin to try to know and understand for yourself what works for you when you experience stress or you experience difficult thoughts and emotions. How do you respond to that? And part of being able to know how to respond to that is building more awareness. Awareness is just attention to how does this show up for me? Because we all experience, for example, if we're using anxiety, we all experience anxiety very differently. So my way of experiencing anxiety and my way of coping with anxiety might be completely different to yours. So I can't just take what you're doing and apply it to my life and expect to get the same results. So parts of understanding and helping us thrive, especially now, is it's really about taking a step back and really asking yourself, how am I really coping with all of this? How am I responding to this? And is how I'm responding, is that in line with what matters to me? Is that how I would like to be responding? And I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, I think there's a question. Okay, how do you balance getting information and avoiding the news?
Yeah, so I think my answer to that would be, one, getting the news is really important, but it's also important to get the news from credible sources, because there are a lot of information out there about COVID, and we also have to be mindful of a lot of conspiracy theories about what is going on, and getting really bogged down with those conspiracy theories about this is what it is. And the reason why I'm saying we have to be mindful about that is because what those conspiracy theories do is that they can instill more fear, and they can get us on this whole trajectory of trying to find the cause of it. But what they don't tell us is how to deal with it. So if you're going to get the news, which is important too, because information is power, information can often help us figure out what we want to do and how we want to stay safe and to improve our well-being during this time. Get credible sources. I mean, from a mental health perspective, I would say credible sources are the NHS, but I'm mindful that is for the UK, the NHS, but that's for the UK. Although I'm quite aware that no matter where you are in the world, you can still kind of access that. Another really good one is WHO. WHO is everywhere, whether you're in Nigeria or you're in America or you're in London. WHO has really great resources for the public about what you should know about COVID-19, what you should do if you think you have the symptoms, what are things that you should look out for. So that's a really good source. And I'm saying this with a lot of hesitation because I know that this is not the same for everyone, but your government websites for some countries where you're at can also be a really good source of information as to what to do. I know that the government website for the UK even touches on things around, if you're struggling with employment, what are things that you can do? But having said that, I'm mindful that's not the case for everyone where you're at. So yes, get the news, because the news will inform you about what's going on in the world and how you can use that to protect yourself and stay safe. But what you can do in terms of balancing that is maybe, have news outlet. I'm going to watch the news for 1 hour today, and this is what I want to get out of the news. And during that time, you read the news. And then outside of that, then you're doing other things that you want to be doing. So yes, that would be what I would say in terms of balancing between the news and getting information and avoiding the news.
Okay, yeah. I know we have NCDC in Nigeria, and their news are pretty credible. So for Nigeria,
great.
might be a good place for information.
Okay. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I wasn't quite sure about what it would be in Nigeria. I'm just quite more aware of what it would be in the UK.
NCDC. So it's yeah. So that's good. Okay, so now let's go a bit more into faith. Yeah, because you're a pastor, so you're going to provide the balance. What's the balance between mental health and faith? Because it looks like they are at different end of the spectrum. People feel like if you're a person of faith, you shouldn't say you're suffering with any mental difficulty, because you should confess the word and just be you should have it all together. So what's the balance between mental health, the possible difficulties that you might face, and your faith?
So I'm going to answer that in a second, but I'm just seeing some comments, and I want to comment on that. So someone says, so it's about responding and not reacting. You hit that on the nail. That's really, really important. So because the way that our minds work, we are very good at reacting. It's almost kind of autopilot. So anything that shows up, we tend to just react. And what we're saying is that by stepping back and trying to identify what is showing up for me, you have a bit more choice to choose how you respond as opposed to reacting. So that hits it on the nail. And then somebody was saying about post-productive version of ourselves, and that being exhausting because we have no idea when the finish light is in sight. And I think that just kind of, again, that's a really key point, because it's something that I think a lot of us are guilty of, is we're all kind of like, we need to be doing the best we can, and we need to be like, doing all the self-development thing right now, so that when we get out of COVID-19, we're like the best version that we've ever been of ourselves. And so I think that's really interesting that you're touching on that. And I think what I would say just goes back to what we were saying before, which is important to take each day at a time, and try not to keep thinking about, okay, what's going to happen down the line, because it is exhausting, because we don't have a clue. It's not really clear what that's going to look like, and it's about taking each day as it comes. And again, because we've said that there isn't quite a right or wrong way of responding, it's just about what can I do at this moment to just keep my well-being and my mental health afloat. And I think that's what's really important. And sometimes one of the great things about insight and reflection is that some of the lessons that we learn about a difficulty is after we've come out of it, and we look back and we think about, okay, what was that like for us? So even though we're all trying to be like, oh yeah, we have to do all these things now so that we can be our best selves post-COVID, actually the things that we do now are really key, just in terms of surviving this and dealing with this, are really key, because we can learn a lot more about how we respond in stressful situations, how we respond in crisis. And it's actually when we're at the finish line and looking back that can help build insight. I'm not sure if that makes sense. So I guess what I'm just trying to say is, take each day at a time, and don't worry so much about being your best self in the future, because when that time comes, it's actually reflecting back on what you did now that can support you moving forward with how you deal with crisis and stress situations moving forward.
Yeah, the person said thank you, so I'm sure she got it.
Okay, great. Okay, so sorry, I diversed. Coming back to faith and mental health, faith and mental health. This it's a big one. I'm very passionate about this as well, because I am a pastor, and I think the first thing to say is that one does not negate the other. It's not an either or situation. So it's not a situation of, you either have faith and you're a Christian, and so that means the absence of any mental health difficulty, or you have a mental health difficulty and that simply means that you don't have faith, or that you're not Christian enough, or that you don't trust in God enough. So it's not, that dichotomy is one that we often fall into traps with, but that is not the case. And I think that if we look at the Bible, there's a lot of information about people who have experienced mental health, even if they didn't call it that. So the Bible, for one, talks a lot about worry, and people kind of somehow think, and because a lot of the ways that the Bible talks about worry is around do not worry, people somehow think that when they're worrying, they're doing something wrong. But it's not the case, because we forget what comes after do not worry. So in the Bible, when God talks about do not worry, it's often because he says after that, because I will provide for you, or I will meet your needs, or I'll be there to protect you. And if we think back to how we describe what worry and anxiety is, anxiety, which also kind of triggers and fuels worry, we said is when you're thinking about a problem that is about to happen in the future and you think that you are unable to deal with it. So when God is telling us to not worry, he's not saying that you're not supposed to experience worry, or that you will not have it. But what God is saying is that the thing that maintains worry, which is the inability to cope, is what he's going to help us with.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So it is, do not worry, because you're worrying that this thing is going to happen. So you're thinking, oh my gosh, this problem is going to show up and I will not cope. And God is saying, actually, when that problem shows up, I'll be there to help you cope. So in other words, what the verses are saying is it's taking the thing that maintains the worry, which is I will not cope, and says I will be there to cope, to help you cope. So worry is natural, is something that will happen. And again, it goes back to that sense of when we are worrying, it's how are we responding to it? What is our frame of mind, and what context are we seeing the worry in? And that's what really does matter. And I think if you think about David, when I read the Psalms, David, he shows symptoms. There are times when he shows symptoms of feeling really low, symptoms of doubting himself, times when he was really anxious, he was overwhelmed with fear, and the reason why David is one of the most talked about characters in the Bible, and why we say that David is the man after God's heart, is not because he had no problems at all. It was because of what he did when he had problems. That's the difference, how he responded when he had problems. And the very first thing he always did was he ran to God. He went there and he expressed everything that he was feeling to God. So, it's normal, and I think we shouldn't try to silence or hide those parts of ourselves. Whether we're struggling with emotions or difficult thoughts, and actually, God tells us a lot of times, like, bring it to me. So, and that just shows you that God is accepting and he's willing to help you with your worries. He's willing to contain that. He says, bring it to me. Come talk to me about it. Tell me what it is that you want, and step aside and let me do it. For God to say that, bring it to me, that just shows that God knows that we will experience it. God knows that it's a natural part of being human. And all he's just saying is, when we see all those things in the Bible about do not or do this, he's just trying to help us and teach us how to respond to it when we experience those things.
Okay, so you can have mental difficulties and still have faith, but then how you deal with it is different.
There you go. It's the dealing. It's the dealing that makes all the difference. And even from a psychology perspective, when we're trying to identify with people around, the number of questions that we ask, we want to know, when did this start? Yeah. So when did you start feeling this way? And another thing that we are really interested in knowing is what is maintaining this. Because what you find is, a lot of times the things that have contributed to why people are struggling is an event that has already come and gone.
Yes.
But the impact of the event remains.
Mm.
So they continue to struggle with the impact of the event, even though the event has ended. And what we're trying to understand is what has led to, why is this still here? What is maintaining this, even though the event has ended? And one of the main things that maintain that impact is how we respond. Because sometimes in the way that we respond, we unintentionally keep those difficulties going and sometimes even amplify them. So when you talk about being a Christian, it's not about not having these things, but it's about how you respond. And a lot of times how you respond is informed by how you make sense of that situation. And as a Christian, what should be informing how you make sense of that situation is who you're linked with. You're linked with God. And like there's a scripture in I think it's Psalm 46, the beginning of Psalm 46 in the New English. And are ever present and well proved help in times of trouble. So and I really like that because I like the two words present and well proved. Well, meaning that when you need him, in the exact moment that you need him, he is there. That moment he is there. And the help that he's providing is well proved. He's done it time and time and time and time and time again. So part of our meaning making when we are faced with difficulty is remembering who we have linked with us. And that can significantly impact our perceived ability to cope. And that can significantly impact our sense of hope that we will get through it. And that's why the Bible also says that, that all things will work together for our good. That's linked to the sense of hope of who we're linked to. So yeah, I think the responding is really key. It's really, really key in terms of when you think about mental health and Christianity.
Okay, so that means that sometimes when Christians go through mental difficulties, they just need to be reminded of who they are linked to. Could that be a way to help?
Being reminded of who they're linked to is definitely one way that can help. It's definitely one way that can help, because I think what that can also do is it can help shift our attention away from the problem and who we have on our side to help us deal with the problem. But I wouldn't say it's the only thing that we do, but it's definitely one of the main things that can be helpful in dealing with difficulties.
Okay, so what other things can we do to help deal with such difficulties?
So I think it just goes back to what we were talking about when I spoke about open, aware, and engaged. And I think it's just a really nice thing to constantly fall back on. And something else that I wanted to really touch on with Psalm 46, there's the part of Psalm 46 in verse 10 that's really popular that says, "Be still and know that I am God." And even though it's a really popular verse, it's a really important one as well. And the reason for that is because in the whole of Psalm 46, it talks about different things that can happen, just a whole bunch of different crises that can happen. And then God starts, and in the Psalms, the scripture starts talking about all the different things that God will do, and says, "Be still and know that I am God." And if you think about it, being still is the counterintuitive thing to do when you're facing trouble. We often want to do the complete opposite. All we want to do when we're facing trouble is just to think about, how can I get rid of it? Or we want to avoid it completely, just deny that it's there, just distract ourselves, just keep distracting ourselves because we don't want to face it. But that scripture says, "Be still and know that I am God." And part of being still is how are you still? What does that look like to be still when you're facing difficulties? And that's letting go of the struggle. Because sometimes we find ourselves struggling with our worries. We're like, I'm not supposed to think this. And then we start worrying about our worries. Oh my gosh, I'm thinking about this, but I'm not supposed to think this. Or we get angry because we're feeling low. Like, why am I always feeling low? What's wrong with me? And we start getting caught up in that struggle with the difficult thoughts and emotions that we are experiencing. And so part of being still is, one, dropping the struggle and stepping back. Yeah. And the thing about stepping back is that when you step back and you let God, so God is telling us that we're not supposed to try to fight these things on our own, or to try to get rid of it on our own. He says that's his job. He's supposed to do that. Your job is to step back. And when we step back, that allows us to have a different perspective, because you're no longer in it. Now you're looking at it.
That's good. Okay.
Yeah. Now you're looking at what's going on for you. And so how are you then, what kind of position are you supposed to take when you're being still? If God is fighting the battle, what your job is to keep going in the presence of difficulty, to keep things that are blockers, that is getting in the way of me keep going the way that I'm supposed to be going. What are these blockers? What are they that what is showing up, which is you stepping back and looking at it, and then thinking, how do I want to respond? So choosing a response, but not fighting or engaging in a struggle with it, because God says, I'm doing that. That's my job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, P-Tobes, we are almost 1 hour gone. So I think that Instagram is going to take us off in the next few minutes. But there's a question here. So I think we'll go off and come back on so that we can save this video. But while we go off, there's a question I want you to think about before we come back. Someone is asking, how do you deal with a spouse or child going through depression? So please just hold that thought. It's already 1 hour, so let's just cut this and then we'll come back right back.
Okay.
So okay. Okay, so Pastor Tobi is back. Okay, welcome back.
Hi.
Welcome back.
Sorry, I was totally distracted for a second there.
No problem. Yeah, so it's been interesting, and we've been learning a lot about mental health. So you were going to answer the question on how to handle a spouse or a child going through depression.
Yeah, so I think the main things to say about this is, when someone that we care about and love, I'm going to start with a spouse. So I reckon I'm aware that the way that we might deal with a spouse and a child might vary in some ways. There's some things that would be similar and some things that would be different. But when someone we care about is dealing with a mental difficulty, whether it's depression, anxiety, or other things, we might have a tendency to want to problem solve. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not our responsibility to problem solve for our loved ones. So what our responsibility is in those situations is to provide an environment for our loved ones to feel safe and heard in a non-judgmental and compassionate way. Yeah. So we want our loved ones to be able to feel safe enough to let us know how they're feeling without the worry that we will judge them for it. To be able to express how they're feeling, and to let them know that we're concerned about them, and to ask them how they would like for us to respond. Now, this is really key, because a lot of times we do things and we think we're helping, but to the person who is actually struggling, it may or not be helpful. So this is about adults now. Yeah. So one, we want to provide a space for them to be able to say how they're feeling, and then two, we want to ask them what they need from us, because sometimes they just want to be heard, they just want us to listen, or sometimes they might want us to take more of an active role, but they should be the one to dictate the level of involvement that they want from us. Now, if we are concerned about our loved ones, then we should express that to them and let them know how they can access help and if they want us to help them with doing that. Yeah, because again, we have to also remember that while we are close to them and we love them, we're not kind of professionals when it comes to dealing with depression, anxiety, or other mental difficulties. So we want to be able to be there for them in a non-judgmental way, to ask them what they need from us and to be present and help them to do that, to let them know if we are that we are concerned about them, and to let them know how they can access help and if they would like us to help them do that or do that with them. Yeah. So that is for, and I know in Nigeria, in terms of how to access help, I'm not very kind of aware of a lot of what the resources are out there. I do know about the I think it's called Mental Awareness NG.
Mm-hmm.
They're really great. They do a lot of really great stuff in terms of mental health, and they even sometimes have hotlines that people can call just to talk to someone that's trained about how they're feeling. And so I think one of the things as well is if you're going to try to support your loved one, if they're going through a difficult time, is to also be able to identify what resources are available around you that they can access. And in the case where there isn't kind of a mental health or trained professional around you that would be able to access, I know that in some cases your pastor or someone else that you both trust might be an alternative, but I would obviously recommend from a kind of ethical and mental health perspective that your first point of contact should always be a trained professional when you're dealing with mental health difficulties. Yeah. For children, WHO, and I'm just going to quickly go through it, have a really lovely infographic handout on how to support children, and this is more kind of tied in with stress around COVID, but it can relate to kind of generally any difficult experiences that they're experiencing. I don't know if it will be helpful to maybe reference that and give information that people can look at later on, as opposed to maybe going through all of that on live.
Can you just give some pointers so that people just have something while they go search for that?
So again, I think similar to adults, is important to remember that children respond to stress and difficulties in a lot of different ways, and depending on their age, the way that they express their stress will be very different, and that's because it's linked to how their cognitive kind of development and how much they can express, whether it is physically or emotionally. And younger children tend to express how they're dealing with things through play, while older children might be able to express that a bit more through words and drawings. So those are really key outlets in terms of helping children to express what they're feeling. I think one of the other key things that has been out there in terms of how to support children is safety, and a sense of love and attention and safety. And especially around this time, what has been recommended is to try to prevent children being separated from their parents a lot during this time, especially because parents are their major caregivers and they can support children in terms of helping them soothe. Another thing that can be really important with children, again, like it is with adults, is about that pattern and routine. Yeah. So because you know how we talked about how pattern is an indication of safety for the mind and for the body. And so developing routines and patterns for children is really important during this time. And this is now COVID specific as well, is to be open and honest with children about what is going on. So the worst thing that we can do at this point is to not share that with them, because even though we're not talking about it, children are really perceptive and they can pick up when things are not going really well, or if mommy and daddy are afraid, or if mommy and daddy are kind of on edge. They might not be able to express that, but they can pick that up. So it's really important to be quite honest and transparent with children about what's going on, and then also kind of talking about ways that we all are doing right now to stay safe.
Okay, so one more question before we go. Okay, well, second to the last question. Is it possible to avoid mental difficulties? And if yes, how do you avoid it?
That's an interesting question because it's also a loaded question. It's loaded because we tend to avoid things if we think that they're negative or they're bad. And I'm very against that because I think that mental health is normal. It's a normal part of life, and depending on what experience that you're experiencing, you will go up and down that spectrum all the time. So is it possible to avoid mental health difficulty? I might kind of change that question a bit, if that's okay with you, and reframe it, which is when we find ourselves in stressful situations or difficult situations, what can we do at that time to support ourselves and to help us get through it?
Yeah.
I think that's maybe a better way to reframe it, because then it's less around trying to avoid something. And I guess another reason why I'm quite particular about that is because if we say that it's possible to avoid it and you're not avoiding it, then what does that say about you? And that begins to have that whole conversation that if you're not able to avoid it, then maybe you're doing something wrong. Or like a normal one that we hear people say all the time, maybe because you don't have enough willpower. or maybe, so we just have to be mindful as well about the words that we use when we're talking about mental health. And dealing with mental difficulties. And again, to remember, because we're talking about anxiety, and there's a difference between experiencing anxiety, for example, and going through having anxiety related difficulties. And that's really important because anxiety is a normal emotion and it serves a function. Yeah. Okay. So anxiety as a normal emotion is there to alert you of potential threat so that your body can prepare to act, whether it's to fight or flight. We all experience anxiety, all of us, there's nobody does not experience anxiety because it's a normal and natural emotion. Yeah. But then when it becomes a difficulty is when you're not able to turn that anxiety switch off.
Okay.
Yeah. So even though the thing around us that was causing the anxiety is not there, the anxiety switch is still on. So I guess I'm saying that to say, when we're talking about mental health and going back to that spectrum, just experiencing difficult emotions and experiencing difficult thoughts, it's normal, it's natural, you will have it. That doesn't mean that you have a mental health problem. That doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. Yeah. It only becomes a difficulty when you're then struggling to switch those things off and it's beginning to impact on your daily functioning. And then all the things that we've talked about in the past about things you can do in terms of how you respond are things that would be helpful and you can try.
Okay, so those are the things to then try to kind of switch off from being overwhelmed by the difficulties, right?
Yeah, or I guess I use switch off with anxiety just because anxiety is also a body reaction. So like your heart beating and sweating and things like that. But what you're trying to do anytime when you're experiencing any emotion is just thinking about how do you deal with it. So we're not trying to what's the word? We're not trying to get rid of it. Because the thing about anxiety and any emotion is that they're transient. They're always coming and going. So like now we're on this call and we're having a good time. We're talking and we're all happy. If at this second a lion just runs into your room where you're at, PB, Your emotion is going to switch from being happy to fear, and you're going to be ready to fight or flight. So what we know is that emotions are constantly going and coming, and they're constantly changing. So actually, we don't really have to try to struggle, like we're talking about before, trying to struggle with them. But it's more about when they are present, how do we deal with it? Because they will often come and go. That's just the nature of emotions.
Okay. Okay, so I think we've done very well because we've gone over and beyond our time. So do you have last words? Like before your last words, is there any pattern that you would consider risky, or at the point where someone needs urgent attention? Like what emotional pattern or emotional what's the word now? What kind of emotion do you think that someone would exhibit that you think the person needs urgent attention? If the person said, "Oh, I'm having difficulty," at what point does it become a matter of urgency, like you need to get help ASAP?
So from a psychology perspective, we'll be thinking about, you're talking about times of crisis. Now, from my perspective, the time when we would kind of say this person needs immediate help or support, they're different situations. So one is around risk. So if you get to the point where your mental health is low, or you're struggling with your mental health to the point where you think of ending your life or harming yourself. So that would be a risk where we say, actually, we need to get you support ASAP in this moment to help you kind of go through that. So those are mostly when we would say immediate, urgent crisis support is when there is, we can foresee, foresee immediate, or there's a high tendency of harm to oneself, whether it's self-inflicted or because of the ways that they're reacting to what they're experiencing, there might be harm to others as well. So that is when we might say we need urgent, or we're doing more crisis management. But that is more of the extreme of that. But it doesn't have to get to that extreme before people are seeking help and support. So like we were saying before, when you just start noticing, if you start noticing that you're struggling to the point where it's beginning to get in the way of living life and your daily functioning, that's probably an indicator to seek help. But that's very different from urgent crisis management.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay, so now we'll take your final thoughts on mental health.
So again, just to say, it's been really great having this conversation with you guys, Church 316. I hope it has been helpful. I'm always quite mindful about talking a lot, but I hope you guys have found it helpful. I think the key things that we have said today is when we talk about mental health, it's kind of similar to what you think about when we talk about physical health. So we're just looking at how you're thinking, feeling, and behaving in order to allow you to continue to engage in what matters to you. When you start struggling with those things, then that's when we might start thinking about how to support you with that. And we talked about mental health being on a spectrum. So even though the images that we have when we think about mental health is more the extreme of the spectrum, when people have gone to the point where they're struggling to the point that they are, like you said, running on the street or naked, that is not the image that mental health should have, even though that is the image that it does have. And we said that the image of mental health is you, me, all of us, because mental health does not show on our face. Mental health is something that we might not know that we're experiencing, only if you express it, or only if they're changing your behavior, that people see and they can pick that up. And another thing that we've talked about is we've normalized emotion. So I know that there's often this idea that we're only supposed to be experiencing positive emotions, but actually all emotions are important. They all serve a function, and they all help us to continue to live and thrive in our environment and our surroundings. And it's only when you're starting to struggle with that and it's getting in the way of things that you should probably get a bit more help. And like we said, when it's about supporting other people, remember to ask questions. How are you? And pause and wait to get the response. And it's not our role to take on the responsibility of problem solving other people's difficulties. Our role is to be present and to provide a compassionate and non-judgmental environment. And for yourself, remember Psalms 46 verse 10, be still and know that God is God. So don't try to struggle with worries and anxiety. Step back, be open to what's showing up, be aware of how you experience those emotions, and choose how you want to respond. Being mindful that a lot of times our worries and anxieties are linked to what we value.
Thank you so much, Pastor Dr. Tobes, for joining us.
It's been my pleasure.
So next time we call you, I'm sure you would answer, right?
Yeah. Of course, anytime. This has been great. I've really enjoyed just speaking with you guys today.
Yeah, we really learned a lot, and I'm sure we'll all put all of that to practice. So thank you so much, Dr. Tobes.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye.